webinar. My name is Jonathan Goldman, and I will be serving today as your technical advisor for this webinar. Please remember that this webinar is presented in listen-only mode, and you will only need your screen and speakers and optionally a keyboard to receive the full experience. And I'm now going to give you a quick introduction to interacting with the GoToWebinar panel, which you should see on your screen right now. And if you have been to this webinar before, or if you've used GoToWebinar, then this should be relatively familiar for you. So just as a test, please find and click the raise hand button, which you will see circled now. And this will let me know that you are hearing me and that you can find the panel. So just press the raise hand button. And when I see that, I'll make sure that it's working. Okay, perfect. I see people are raising their hands. Great, great. So it looks like that's working. Now, I also want to show you how you can interact with our webinar. So as you can see down here, if you type anything into this questions box, that text will be sent to me, and then I will be able to see if you are having trouble, or I'll be able to read your questions and forward them to our presenters. So just to make sure that that works for everyone right now, please type where you are right now, where you're watching this from, and how many people are sitting with you. For example, I am in Boston, and I'm by myself presenting this. So write that into the questions part, and we'll make sure that that's working as well. Awesome. We've got people on the West Coast, on the East Coast, in the middle, all over. That's great. Well, remember that you can type into this question box at any time during the webinar, and it will not distract our presenters, so don't worry. And this will bring us the best questions to them during the Q&A section when we get to there. The last feature you should know about is the minimize button for the GoToWebinar. If you are on the small screen or the panel is in your way, you can click this orange button and the panel will slide off to the right side of the screen. So if you want to bring the panel back to ask a question, you just click on the orange button again. And that's all there is to it. GoToWebinar is a simple platform, and just as a friendly reminder, as we are serving this webinar to sometimes upwards of 500 people, if there are any technical glitches or dropouts, remember that we do record these sessions and it will be available to watch later, so don't worry about that. And you can watch it by going to youtube.com/user/Neary training. And then at 3 o'clock, our host today will get on and start the presentation, so as soon as I'm done. But until then, just hang on and we'll start soon.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first webinar of our 2018-2019 webinar season. My name is Craig Latham, and I'm the Executive Director of Neary. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Growing Beyond, an Introduction to Adolescent Girls with Sexually Abusive Behavior, presented by Sue Robinson. Before turning the webinar over to Sue, I want to take a few minutes to tell you about Neary Press. Our mission is to share current research and best practices emerging in our field. For many years, we accomplished that mission only through book sales. But with changes in the last several years in the publishing and technology worlds, we now disseminate knowledge in several additional ways. Over the last 6 years, Neary Press has also offered online courses, a free monthly newsletter, in-service, in-person trainings, and these webinars delivered by our internationally recognized authors and other experts in the field. It's important to us at Neary Press and Training Center to hear what kinds of information, training, resources, and books you want. So please contact us with your suggestions, questions, and feedback, whether positive or negative. Now, how many of you have participated in a Neary Press webinar before? Jonathan, can you launch the poll for us, please? All right. Getting some responses here, I think. That's good. All right. Thank you. I'll talk more about this at the end of the webinar, but I'd just like to make the pitch that if you find these webinars helpful, we hope you'll consider becoming a sponsor of our webinar series. You can think of our webinars like Car Talk on NPR. It's your sponsorship that helps make this series happen and that allows us to offer our webinars for free to the thousands of clinicians and other professionals who have participated in them over the last several years. Please consider becoming a sponsor of this webinar series. If you become a sponsor now, you'll be guaranteed seats to all the webinars in the 2018-2019 season. We will register you and 15 staff members from your organization for each webinar, offer you a free gift of 2 Neary Press books, and mention you in all of our publicity about the webinar series and at each webinar. Before we get started with Sue's presentations, there are just a few more things I'd like to share. First, I would like to let you know the learning objectives. At the end of this webinar, participants will be able to describe the literature specific to this population, identify 4 main areas to assess with girls who have committed sex offenses, and state the clinical needs and associated treatment goals of this population. Second, I want to let you know that the YouTube recording from this webinar will be posted on the Neary Press website by September 19th. Slides are currently available to download from the Neary Press webinars page at nearypress.org/webinars if you'd like to follow along. As Jonathan mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, you can also download the slides right here from your control panel on the right-hand side of your screen, near the bottom. Third, when the workshop is over, please answer the short survey at the end. We would love to have your feedback. And finally, in about a week, you will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recordings and to a certificate of attendance that you can download. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Susan Robinson is a therapist in private practice at the New England Counseling and Trauma Associates in Williston, Vermont. She has over 20 years of clinical experience specializing in the assessment and treatment of adolescent and adult female offenders. She wrote the first workbook specifically designed for teenage girls who have sexually abused, entitled Growing Beyond, a workbook for teenage girls. And she has also authored chapters on the assessment and treatment of sexually abusive girls. Finally, Sue has provided many trainings on female sexual offending across the United States. Please join me in welcoming Sue with a virtual round of applause. She will probably not be able to hear you clap, but she will sense it. Thank you, Sue, for joining us.
Oh, wonderful applause. Thank you so much. So, and yes, in terms of the objectives, which Craig laid out, I just want to add a little bit more. So understanding the literature specific to this population is very important since research needs to guide practice. And then I'm going to provide a very brief overview of assessment. And according to the Center for Sex Offender Management, gender responsive treatment really includes developing gender responsive management and understanding the unique risk and protective factors, the developmental pathways to crime and delinquency, and the fundamental differences between the genders. So my hope for today is that you acquire the knowledge base to provide gender responsive treatment. I will also go over some apparent differences between sexually abusive girls and boys and review typologies as well. Next slide. Next slide, please. So there is a culture of denial when it comes to female sexual offending behavior. And in that regard, there is a gender dichotomy that males do and females don't, and that has been the dominant paradigm. And due to this paradigm, historically, there's been a lack of services and programs to adequately address girls' needs, despite the fact that amendments were made to the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act as far back as 1992, specifically mandating that states develop and deliver gender-specific services. Next slide. So aggressiveness is gendered, and I believe we need to examine female sex offending behavior through a lens of female development and epistemology. So this way we can keep our minds open and learn about the subtle and not so subtle distinctions from what we've already learned about male sex offending. There will definitely be similarities, but differences will also be present. Next slide. So in terms of the statistics, for juvenile arrests, females under age 18 account for 2% of the arrests for forcible rape and 10% of the arrests for other types of sexual offenses, excluding prostitution. Next slide, please. There are a bunch of research limitations which you're looking at in terms of unrepresentative samples, poor generalizability. There are small sample size in some of the research, as small as 10 and up to 177. So despite these research limitations noted in this slide, there are strong consistencies across studies. Next slide, please. In terms of one of the greatest areas of gender difference is when you look into the sexual victimization histories of sexually abusive girls. Many of those who end up abusing have very strong sexual abuse histories themselves. So you can look at all these statistics in various studies. These are the comparative studies. And with descriptive studies, the rates are also very high. I just want to point out maybe one or two of these studies to give you some context. So Micchio Fonseca study, that was a sample size of 18, but it actually included both adult and adolescent females. And that was a study comparing them to 332 sexually abusive males and 215 non-sex offending females. The Matthews, Hunter, and Voots, that 1997, that was a study, a sample of 67 girls from outpatient and residential treatment compared to 70 boys from the same settings. Okay, next slide. So again, the descriptive studies, you see a wide range depending on what study you're looking at. And in a 2010 study, 2010, a history of sexual abuse was the single most significant predictive variable for sexually abusive behavior for girls. Next slide, please. And so what we also see with the sexual victimization histories with these girls, they have often been abused at very, very young ages. So in one study, 64% of the girls were sexually abused prior to the age of 5, compared to 25.8% of the boys. In another study, the median age of their abuse was 4. In another one, the median age was 4.5. So they're getting abused at young ages, but also by multiple perpetrators. So in one study, the mean number of perpetrators for girls was 4.83 versus 1.75 for boys. In another one, the mean number of perpetrators for girls was 5, ranging from 2 to 7 total. There was one case I worked on where a girl was, and it was documented, was sexually abused by 9 different people prior to the age of 10. So in the Hickey study, they also found that being a female, as opposed to a male juvenile with sexually abusive behavior, is predicted by having a higher number of perpetrators in their own sexual victimization history. Next slide, please. The other things we see is that many of these girls have been abused by female perpetrators. So in the Matthews et al. Study, there was 3 times as many girls than boys that reported having been sexually abused by a female perpetrator. And in a different study, girls were more often than boys abused by relatives, and more often than boys abused by both relatives as well as acquaintances. Okay, next slide, please. Many of these girls have also experienced other forms of maltreatment. And in many of the studies, you also see neglect there. In Whedon's study, 43% of the girls had experienced all 4 maltreatment experiences, including sexual abuse. So just very high levels of neglect, high levels to family exposure. Next slide. So girls are more likely than boys to witness domestic violence and inappropriate sexual behavior in the home. I can't tell you how many times I've worked with girls that have told me they saw men coming in and out of their house and having mom have sex. And in Victoria Whedon's study, she found that 47.7% of these girls came from highly sexualized family environments. Next slide. So, conclusions with the victimization histories. Females who commit sexual offenses tend to have more severe histories of maltreatment than their male counterparts. And Matthews et al. Concluded that biological and socialization factors create a higher threshold for the externalization of experienced developmental trauma in females than in males, and that females who develop those patterns are generally those who have experienced very high developmental trauma in the absence of environmental support for recovery and in the absence of having healthy female role models. Next one. So the other striking thing is the mental health issues that many of these girls present with. Of course, having just spoken about the sexual victimization they experience, it's not surprising that we see high levels of post-traumatic stress. In one study, comparative study, 59.1% of the girls had PTSD versus 26.4% of the boys. And in another one, another study, the Kubik et al., 45.5% of boys had conduct disorder versus 9.1% of girls, and 50% of the girls had PTSD versus 9.1% for the boys. There's also studies that show high rates of reactive attachment. And the suicide ideation, that's interesting. In Mickey Fonseca's study, 44% of the females had attempted suicide versus 15% of the males. And likewise, 50% of the females came from families where someone had attempted suicide versus 8% of the males. So that's a big statistical difference when it comes to this. So of course, you know, many clients I've worked with have had struggles with suicide and depression and PTSD and all the things noted above. Academically, there are problems that range, depending on the study, anywhere from 40% of the girls to 83% of the girls. Okay, next. I also see in the studies a lot of running away, stealing, truancy, relational deficits. And by relational deficits, I mean poor peer relationships, social skill problems, social isolation, and relational aggression. The relational aggression is characterized by the threat of withdrawal of affiliation for the purpose of controlling the behavior of others. So it is harming someone by damaging or threatening to damage a relationship, by social exclusion, shutting somebody out, silent treatment, all of that not so fun stuff. Next slide, please. So the motivations to sexually abuse when it comes to girls, a lot of the research points to it being more about anger and mainly towards main caretakers. So for example, I had a girl that was very, very angry at her mother for not believing that she had been sexually abused. So she acted out on a sister as a way for her to kind of express her anger towards her mother. I think at times it is a resistance to cultural scripts that actually teach girls to be passive, inexperienced, naive, and accommodating in sexual relationships. It's a rejection of cultural norms that teach girls to be silent and unaware of their sexuality. Some girls have explained their offending behavior, for example, in the context of a babysitting situation, was a way for them to learn about sex on their own terms or to explore their sexual orientation. Other girls refer to their motivation as protection by perpetration. They don't have to worry about being victimized because they're doing the victimizing. I had one client say, I will not be a victim or place myself in any kind of position to be victimized again. And then there's the victimizer cycle, the sexual dysregulation, sexually reactive behaviors, and also there's a part of it that can be related to attachment in terms of perpetrating is often motivated by the desire to establish or maintain an emotional relationship with someone. Sometimes it's a mother, sometimes it's somebody else in the family. I had one girl who sexually abused her brother every time she felt he was pulling away from her. And we know that when the attachment system fails in some way, the sexual system may come into play in a substitute manner. Moving on, please. In terms of some of the differences that we see between girls and boys who engage in sex offending behavior, we know girls are less likely to be adjudicated, and they are less likely to be adjudicated for committing a sexual offense on a peer. Although we'll come back to that later when we talk about group offending. Girls are more likely to enter the system as victims. Boys are more likely to enter the system due to concerns about the safety of others. And a girl who offends may perceive herself as bad because she has not acted in a manner that is consistent with how girls are taught to behave in our society. So the internalization of shame appears higher for girls who sexually offend in this regard. They often feel like they're the only girl on the planet who has ever engaged in that kind of behavior. Parents, I think, are also less likely to understand how their daughter could have engaged in sexually abusive behavior, so they want to contextualize it to be about some prior known or unknown sexual abuse. Next slide, please. So, boys are more likely to abuse females, but girls appear to select victims out of convenience rather than genuine preference for one gender. Both comparison and descriptive studies indicate girls tend to be younger when they sexually abuse others. So in one study, 49% of girls sexually abused between the ages of 11 and 13. 50% of the boys were in the 14 to 16 age range. And the victims of females are younger. This was contradicted in one study, Vanderveer 2010, who found that girls were likely to have victims closer to their own age, but the reason for that is that that study focused a lot on co-offending, group offending. And girls are more likely to be involved in incidents with multiple victims. Next slide, please. Girls often sexually abuse in caretaking roles. This is true for adult females who offend as well. It does appear that girls are less likely to abuse strangers and less predatory in that regard. And I have seen so many girls that are in therapy for this kind of behavior that have major, very difficult dependency issues and experience re-victimization in their current relationships. Next slide, please. Girls' reasons for offending appear to be different from boys. There is that relational aggression element or that anger element, usually of the caretaker. And I do find that girls engage in more cognitive distortions about altruistic caretaking. For example, one of my clients had said she was sexually abusing her sister because it was only a matter of time that her stepfather was going to abuse his sister, so she saw it as she was just preparing her. Another one tried to explain it as she, with her sister, was filling a motherly role by helping her sister overcome masturbation and to help her sister learn private parts. So those are a few of the differences. And now, next slide, please. I think there are three basic categories for girls that end up engaging in sexually abusive behavior, although of course it's a very heterogeneous population. But I'll break down these three categories. The first one is predisposed offending, and these girls have sexual abuse histories and or high levels of individuals' family psychopathology, and they are sexually abusing primarily due to those origins. Their offending behavior often mirrors the manner in which they were sexually abused. They often experience multiple forms of abuse. They may have diagnoses such as PTSD, depression, conduct disorder, or anxiety disorder. They often present with attachment or empathy deficits. They may have inappropriate sexual fantasies, pairing their own victimization experiences with arousal. And they can engage in compulsive lying. They're very good at kind of trying to figure out what you want to hear. They may have a strong desire to get pregnant. There's what I call a preoccupation with relational chaos. They will push you away if you get too close. They have huge trust issues and may engage in unsafe sexual behavior. They can be manipulative and think in very extreme manners, black and white thinking, and cutting behaviors. Next slide, please. The experimenting, exploiting category, their primary motivation is sexual curiosity. If they have a sexual abuse history, it wasn't as profound as the first group I was telling you about. And they don't seem to be abusing because of any abuse in their histories. It's primarily motivated by curiosity and opportunity. This is often while babysitting or when around younger family members. These girls typically have low levels of psychopathology. They lack social skills and fear their own sexuality. They are naive at times and lack any prior sexual experience. They may be shy and possess low self-esteem and poor body image, which is why they're seeking younger object choices. They don't feel competent or confident at all to be with somebody their age. Next one. So this category is peer-influenced offending or co-offending or group offending. And this part I find very interesting in what's been coming out in the research about this. So I'm going to spend a few slides on this. So it's offending due to pressure from peers or group involvement. Recent research shows this is more common with girls than it is with sexually abusive boys. There's often a female ringleader, and there can be like a queen bee and wannabe dynamic. They might gang up on an unliked girl. The ringleader might possess callous and emotional strengths. If I have time later, I can talk about a case I worked on with that. Next slide, please. So in this study, females more likely than males to offend with others as well as with adults. And this is, of course, is very consistent with what we know about adult female offenders who are male coerced or male accompanied offenders and active or passive accomplices. Next slide, please. This was a comparison study of 177 juvenile boys and 177 juvenile girls. The girls were more likely to be involved in rings, quote unquote rings, of at least 2 and up to 9 co-offenders. So Van der Veer found that the girls with co-offenders differ substantially from girls who act alone. When girls act with another person, the dynamics of the offending change and typically include more serious factors. Co-offenders were significantly more likely to have multiple victims and more likely to have a female victim, and they were more likely to be arrested for rape. So Van der Veer concluded that social amplification occurs when girls offend in a way that is different with boys. Next slide. Thanks. So this is from 2015, a sample comprised of all the juvenile females who sexually offended in the Netherlands from 1994 to 2008. So aside from their sample size of 35 girls, there was 32 juvenile male co-offenders, 12 adult male co-offenders, and 3 adult female co-offenders. All the offenders were acquaintances or relatives of each other, and usually they were acquaintances or relatives of the victim, and only 2 groups victimized a person unknown to them. The differences between the victim and the offender age were small. The 3 youngest victims, age 7, 9, and 9, were all abused by romantic couples consisting of a juvenile female and her adult male partner. The offenses committed because of sexual gratification appeared mainly instigated by the sexual motivation of the male co-offenders. The role of the female offenders in the offense varied. Some were active and participated in sexual acts or battered or threatened the victim, while others provoked other group members or created opportunities for other group members to commit the offense, such as by introducing the victim to the offender or by rendering no effort to stop the abuse. Nearly half of them did not actually commit a hands-on sexual offense. 73% of the group used some kind of violence during their offense, like beating, kicking, threatening, spitting, yelling, or insulting. Next slide. For 63% of juvenile females, group dynamics played a dominant role. They wanted to belong to the group, they felt pressured to engage and participate, or they could not resist joining in. Some of the juvenile females who committed the offense with their male intimate partner reported they were forced, either physically or emotionally. The remaining juvenile females co-offended for instrumental reasons such as revenge. The authors found differences from male group offending, and the differences include less penetration, offenses seemed less serious by comparison, none of the females reported threatening the victim for silencing purposes, and the harassment aim seems more prevalent than among male group sexual offending. And revenge as an aim is not commonly found in juvenile male group sexual offending. It is, however, consistent with the literature on adult female sex offenders. From an instrumental perspective, the female offenders use the male offender to humiliate the victim or to aid in carrying out the offense, or the male offender uses the female to get access to other females or to younger children. The notion of sexual humiliation, punishment, or revenge is seen as rather unique among female sexual offending. And next slide. Just a few slides on assessment. Best practice, I think, is really based on a thorough understanding of female development and the research that's conducted thus far in sexually abusive girls. There does tend to be a greater reliance on self-report, and I think you need to pay very close attention to the more subtle and covert behaviors and internalization responses that girls may have in addition to their more overt behavioral problems. Next slide. When I'm assessing a girl with sexually abusive behavior, I am determining what kind of relational development, what is her female identity, what's her attachment style, does she have unhealthy or healthy female role models, what are the dynamics of the mother-daughter relationship, has she perceived a maternal loss? Because sometimes what happens is the girls feel like mom abandoned them for a boyfriend or for younger siblings, and they don't spend a lot of time with the teenage girl, and they do feel a loss. Is she in any abusive relationships? Is her identity stable or is it disorganized? Does she easily change her identity based on whom she is with and what she perceives that others want her to be? I refer to that as the chameleon identity. Does she voice and assert herself, or does she possess a more passive orientation? What other relational losses has she experienced? In regards to her sexual functioning, I'm going to ask, is she sexually passive and an object for others, or does she take ownership of her sexuality? What about reproductive health, body image, sexual knowledge in general? Does she have a desire to get pregnant? For mental health, I would be looking at, is there any suicidal ideation, behaviors, depression, self-mutilation, eating disorders, and the rest of other mental health concerns. Looking at offending behavior, I would be looking at, we're not quite there yet. If the motivation is sex equals love, or if it's trauma reenactment or relational aggression, and looking at cognitive distortions and typology and pathways to offending. I would also look at history of maltreatment. Was there a female perpetrator? Was there a negative outcome to disclosing any abuse and that maybe they weren't believed? And Johnson's study done, I think, in 1989, so a while back, all of these girls in that study had been sexually abused in their histories, and not one of those girls received a positive response from their disclosure of being victimized. And then I also look at, is there any conduct disorder behavior, like manipulative patterns, a pattern of persistent using of other people, disregarding feelings, me syndrome, and compulsive lying. Okay, next one. Looking at the clinical needs, then, it is about addressing and processing victimization histories, overcoming victim identities, and understanding the relationship between victimization and perpetration. And I see a treatment goal is to help them develop their self-concept, their identity formation. Many girls who offend have a poor self-sense of themselves. They can act like chameleons, changing depend on what environment they are in and with whom they're associating. So it is about developing an authentic, true self. Also involves reducing any of those chameleon tendencies. And I think to help them develop healthy relational patterns and healthy boundaries, building social skills, increasing social supports, exploring difficulties of trusting others, and encouraging them to take risks to trust, and reducing any preoccupation with relational chaos. Next. So certainly we want these girls to develop a strong sense of their voice and to be able to assert herself. The reality is, since so many of these girls have been sexually abused in their background, there's a lot of girls that have a very much freezing response, and so they're not great at being able to stand up for themselves in any situation where they feel mild pressure. I want them to learn about female sexuality and develop healthy sexual subjectivity, developing healthy female sexual self, learning about arousal and desire and birth control and STDs. Many of these girls lack sexual knowledge or appropriate sexual knowledge. And so it's not surprising at times they find themselves in these situations. Certainly another goal is to help them with self-esteem and self-care strategies, helping them acquire grounding and mindfulness strategies, building regulation capacities, distress tolerance skills, and again, setting limits with other people. And we have to eliminate any self-destructive, self-harming behaviors, and also improve her working model. So we want it to be a secure attachment. And early on, we also assess the attachment. Is it preoccupied, avoidant, or dismissive attachment? Next slide. I like the girls to identify healthy female role models for themselves. And we also have to, of course, given on the situation, address family dynamics. And that could mean increasing attunement, working to increase trust and communication with girls and their caregivers. And sometimes, quite frankly, it's also about emotional emancipation in that a girl has come from a very, very damaged family system, and it keeps her back if she finds a way to kind of emotionally emancipate from the family system. That can serve her to go a long ways. Next. So the therapeutic process with girls, I just wanted to share a few thoughts about that. I think the alliance, of course, it has to be based on respect and feeling heard and supported. And female adolescent development is a relational development. And so it's all about working on a very much relational level with them. At the same time, there has to be clear, consistent boundaries instead of resorting to loosey-goosey boundaries in the service of the relationship. Oftentimes girls want to know about you and your life, and they say, well, why am I going to share anything with you if you don't share with me? And that's kind of how they go about forming relationships. But you have to be very clear then, where are the lines that are going to be drawn so you don't get sucked in with inappropriate boundaries or into a transference, countertransference nightmare. I do believe it has to be strength-based and holistic, collaborative instead of confrontational. If I do confront, I confront in a way that I know the girls so well, and I do it in a joking way, and it can work for me. By collaboration and joking confrontation works well. And I think respecting their survival strategies as adaptations to prior trauma. And sometimes that's a really hard one when they're trying so hard to push me away and push me away and push me away. But I'm still there. And then there should be a dual specialization. So whoever's working with a girl who's sexually abused or in a group, they should be both trauma informed and offense specific in their approach. Okay. So next slide. Definitely don't give up on the girls. Many of them expect this and at times create circumstances to deliberately push you away and sometimes push you away hard. And listen, don't assume the dynamics are the same with females. Certainly we know enough now in this field that we don't apply a one-size-fits-all model. I think and being a therapist is really about trying to role model respect with every interaction, because so many of these girls came from broken homes where there was a lack of respect and abuse going on. And respect their need for relationship. That's really, really important. So respect both their need for relationship as well as their need to process. Processing is very different with girls groups versus boys groups. Also, do not forget there can be significant post-traumatic growth with these girls. They go through horrible, horrible stuff. They do horrible stuff, but they can come out on the other side, which is why I named the book Growing Beyond, because for me, it really is getting these girls to a place of growing beyond. So that is my talk.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much for that very interesting presentation. You've really highlighted some of the differences between male offenders and female offenders. Fascinating stuff. So we have some questions for you. One, just a little practical question. What is the citation or source for your slide about the motivation of female offenders? You talked about anger at caregivers and so on.
That slide is that's from me.
Okay.
In terms of what I've seen in my work.
Great. All right. One other thing, you gave the three groups in the typology. Are there different treatment approaches for those three groups, and can you commingle the people together?
I have commingled the people together, definitely. I think if you have enough girls, it's really nice to have a group because they do form relationships with one another, and they are very much supportive of one another. Well, most of the time anyway. So I have had no problems in the past commingling. It's just with somebody who's like a predisposed, they might require more individual psychotherapy to focus on eye movement, desensitization, reprocessing, like EMDR kind of stuff to get to that trauma stuff.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that group treatment is necessary to treat female offenders?
I don't think it needs to be mandated. I don't think it's necessary, but it is beneficial if you have a good working group, because like I said earlier, when a girl gets in trouble for sexually offending on somebody, usually she does feel like she's the only girl on the planet. And so if she can be in a safe, supportive group with other girls, I think that really helps reduce the shame they feel.
Great. One of the things that is very different than in the adolescent male world is the extent to which treatment services are manualized, and there's a certain set of skills that are worked on in a group. It sounds like you're working on much more of a developmental model, and certainly some skills, but they're more emotional skills and developmental skills than cognitive or intellectual skills. Can you comment on that a little bit?
Well, there's a lot of the CBT kind of stuff, and certainly there's a blend of the offense specific and then the other things to deal with their levels of trauma in terms of building distress tolerance skills and all that kind of stuff. So it's like walking on a tightrope, trying to do the trauma-informed work and the offense-specific at the same time.
Great. So here's a clinical question for you. This clinician works with a teen whose mother engaged her in sex trafficking as a child. The client tends to go on the run, engages in the life on the run, and then recruits. Could you elaborate on the emotional emancipation piece as relevant to this client?
Okay, so I would want to know what other supports this client has in place so there can be some kind of way to, you know, the mother and daughter relationships can be so complicated, but the mother is getting the daughter to do trafficking stuff. First, I'm wondering if the mother has been charged, and I'm wondering where the daughter is living. I mean, I feel like I need more information, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, are female therapists better for these girls or ladies in your experience?
I think the best situation is to have a group with a male and a female co-facilitator.
Interesting. And what are the different roles that they play in the group?
Well, naturally, the male ends up being more like a dad, but many of these girls have been abused, so they don't want initially. What I have found that when they learned, for example, I was going to bring in a facilitator, half the girls in the group totally freaked out. The parents freaked out. She was abused by a man. You can't. But what we found is having the man in there was wonderful in terms of um, just role playing things at times, being a non-abusive uh, caregiver of sorts, and helping these girls realize that boys can be safe, men can be safe.
Great.
And then facilitator would be like a father figure almost. Reparative. There's a lot of reparative work in that.
Great. Another question from one of our listeners is, what are some strategies for getting professionals, case managers, behavioral coaches, and so on, to understand that a girl can actually sexually offend? She encounters many professionals who only see the female offender as a victim and only want to offer victim therapy.
Yes, that drives me crazy, and that question can make me go on a rant, but I will try not to. I think that people need to know that there needs to be more training out there, really, for people, and it doesn't have to be me, like other people who specialize in working with females, talking to attorneys, talking to judges, knowing that even though they were sexually abused, that doesn't mean they didn't engage in a sexual offense and that they don't need to be treated for that. So many of the boys that abuse are also abused, but they don't seem to want to, take that into account.
For sure. One other question is the difference between the male offenders and the female. There are many assessment tools that people favor in the world of adolescent male offenders. It sounds like you rely more on an interview and what you gain from that discussion. Are there tools that you typically use in your assessment?
I use the trauma and attachment belief scale to look at abuse. A PTSD checklist measure I also use. What's another? The sexual behavior inventory. Yeah, so a few of those.
Okay.
Breer's measure that focuses on trauma.
Yep. The trauma symptom checklist?
Yes, thank you. I was trying to remember.
There you go. Okay. Can you describe what a typical group might sound like, if there is a typical group?
I haven't done a group in a while because I live in Vermont now, but and the numbers are not as high, but there can be a lot of interrupting. At times I felt like I was a referee in a sports game, because they all get in there, they all want to process, they all want to talk, they all want to share. And so sometimes it can be difficult to manage all that. But if you lay down the group rules really on, like obviously no interrupting and that kind of stuff. And then also sometimes they use the preoccupation with relational chaos to not focus on the issues they need to focus on. So there's a balancing act between process and content.
That's great. So you're building relationship skills while you're building some emotional skills at the same time.
Yeah.
Great. Someone just typed in a question. In addition to the tools that you mentioned in doing your assessment, are there specific things that courts find interesting if you're doing a psychosexual evaluation as part of a legal proceeding?
I don't know. There's so many out there. I mean, and I can't remember them off the top of my head. Sometimes I use a CBCL. And the one for the schools to get a good look at that, and the one for parent. And there's the adolescent sexual behavior inventory that Frederick developed that I use, that has a caregiver report as well as the teenager report. So there are things out there.
Great. And our last question, do you do any specific exercises to deal with cognitive distortions, or do you just note them and hope that they will go away as the young lady learns more things about herself or her emotional competence?
Oh, I address it directly.
So you teach about them?
Yes, definitely.
How do you do that?
I have a list of all the different thinking errors, and I ask them to take a self-assessment in terms of what kind of thinking errors they think they have, whether it's justifying or minimizing or denial or blaming, externalizing, whatever. And so, and I just tend to be very direct with them. I'll say to them, maybe in a joking way, like, what kind of thing is that to say that he asked for it, kind of thing. And they learn that, and they learn that well.
Great. Well, that's the end of our time today. We could have gone on with many, many more questions, I'm sure, but we've reached the end of our hour. Thank you so much. I just have a few announcements to pass on to people about the webinar series. As a thank you for attending today, for our attendees, we're offering a special discount. Use the code SROB18 until October 10th, 2018 to get 20% off of Sue's Growing Beyond books in our bookstore, which you can find at the website listed on the slide. We also invite you to take a look at our full lineup for this upcoming webinar season, which you can view here and which will be shortly posted on our website, the nerypress.org/webinars website. We have a real exciting group of folks that are going to be presenting for us again this year. We are also offering limited paid continuing education credits for our 2018-2019 seminars. Paid CE credits will be available for psychologists and social workers for all webinars in our 2018-2019 series. For details about how to obtain CE credits, please visit nerypress.org/webinars and read through the CE process. If you still have questions after that, you can email Kristen at the email address listed on the slide. And next, we have the Neary Press and Training Center's free Research to Practice e-newsletter. This is free and it comes out about every month. We discuss a new or controversial journal article or research paper and examine its implications for clinicians in the field. You are automatically signed up for this, and we hope you'll find it useful. Sponsorship. Please consider becoming a sponsor for our 2018-2019 webinar series. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're excited to begin planning a brand new slate of webinars covering new and crucial knowledge in the field, guided by you, our listeners. To our previous sponsors in the 2017-2018 series, thank you for your commitment to Neary Press webinar series. We would love to invite you to consider renewing your sponsorship for this year if you haven't already. If you sign up to be a sponsor, as our thanks to you, we'll send you 2 Neary Press top popular titles, current applications and current perspectives, or 2 new books if you've already received these 2. If you become a sponsor now, you'll be guaranteed seats to all webinars in the 2018-2019 season. And if you sign up as an organization, your organization is guaranteed 15 seats. We will also do your monthly registration for you. We will publicize your name or organization on our website, in our publicity, and on each webinar. Sponsorship is $98 for individuals and $250 for organizations. If you are interested in being a sponsor, please contact us directly at info@nearypress.org or call. Finally, thank you to our brand new 2018-2019 sponsors. You can see them here on the screen. They include organizations, agencies, and individuals. We would not be able to hold these webinars without their support. And finally, if you like this webinar, you can see previous webinars on our website at nearypress.org and on Neary Press's YouTube channel. It is possible to pay for CE credits for all past recorded webinars. Thanks again to Sue for such a great webinar on such an important topic, and a huge thank you to all of you for attending. I'd like to say again how much we welcome your feedback, so please complete your evaluation form when you close out the webinar. Thank you and good afternoon.